Our next storyteller, Kristiana Dhillon. When she's not getting lost in the African bush or saving friends from anaphylactic shock in the Canadian wilderness, she's planning her next adventure. Please welcome Kristiana with her story, The Hyperreal.
This will be good. Yeah. Okay. So just to give you a heads up, it's going to be a little bit of a change of pace. I spent much of the first decade of my life lost in dream, frantically trying to grasp onto something solid. From the age of 18 months until puberty, I endured a relatively unknown type of seizure disorder called temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, it's not what you're thinking. You see, instead of my seizures leaving me convulsing and unconscious, instead, they would strand me in a strange sort of purgatory that seemed to superimpose itself over my waking existence, almost like an intense bout of deja vu. First would come the hyperreal. Now, in this phase, everything around me would seem to sharpen, as if my environment had originally been out of focus. Then would come the images. Now, they weren't hallucinations per se, more like memories that had pushed themselves to the forefront of my consciousness. Strange thematic connections between what was going on around me and the disjointed narratives that only ever appeared in my dreams. And after that, finally, my stomach would lurch into a burst of butterflies, a sensation of falling while standing still. Now, the whole experience was sort of the opposite of lucid dreaming. So rather than being asleep but knowing that you're dreaming, I was awake, and yet I felt as if I was in a dream. My seizures and the epilepsy eventually went into remission when I was 11 years old. But even so, the sense of being caught in between stuck with me. And as a result, I've spent much of my life searching for a place to belong. This story is about that search. As I grew older, and though the seizures went away, the desire to escape and to find just a place to be intensified, as did the bullying. Many people in high school thought I was weird, and I was often victim to really vicious verbal and sometimes physical attacks from other girls. I was lonely and miserable, and yet no amount of daydreaming could remove me long enough to provide a sense of relief. Except maybe writing lots of emo poetry and fantasizing about all the people who had ever wronged me crying at my funeral. But that's another story for another time. That said, everything changed when I got a car. While previously limited to hanging out at the local strip mall, a whole new world beyond the Silicon Valley suburbs had opened up. And so every weekend, a friend and I would explore the Santa Cruz Mountains in my secondhand convertible Volkswagen, listening to Radiohead, Death Cab for Cutie, and Weezer in full blast. I lived for those weekends and that car. But somewhere at the back of my mind, I knew that there would only be so many roads for me to drive before my world began to feel small. One Saturday in autumn, a friend and I decided to explore the hills on the east side of the Santa Clara Valley. So we drove up the side of Mount Hamilton to visit the Lick Observatory. Now, this friend had a habit of falling asleep every time we drove anywhere. And so as I'm winding around the dry foothills, she eventually starts to drift off. And then it's just me and the music. It was a very foggy day, and there was this really thick layer of clouds that obscured the top of the mountain. And as I drove, I remember thinking how wonderful it was that my friend, even though she was sleeping, was there with me on this journey into the unknown. My car started careening closer and closer to this layer of fog. And as I did, the music seemed to kind of crescendo at the same time. And finally, I broke through. Stephanie, wake up, look. She was still asleep. But when I broke through the clouds, all of a sudden, it was perfectly clear. Where the Bay Area was supposed to be was just miles and miles of a thick layer of white, it looked like an ocean, under a blue sky. The sun let off this wonderful amber light, and I thought, maybe this is what my heaven would eventually look like. I returned to those heavens in my last year of high school when I got on a plane to visit my aunt in her village in England. Now, I traveled internationally before, but this was my first time going on my own. And so it was the middle of winter, and I was in the middle of my beatnik literature phase, so I was fully taken by the romance and freedom of just being on the road. I was also away from all the drama of high school, and for the first time, I finally felt at ease in my aloneness. One afternoon, I borrowed my aunt's bicycle and decided to ride along the river behind her house to the next village. It was afternoon, and the sun was low in the sky, and it cast a soft glow on the snow blanketing the ground. And as I rode along that river on that bike, headphones blasting Radiohead, I all of a sudden noticed that the snow seemed to kind of come in sideways, and I couldn't tell whether the sun was rising or setting. Now, in hindsight, I wasn't having a seizure. It had grown out of them. But this wave of euphoria washed over me. I was alone. But more importantly, I was free. Free from all the pain and limitations of being at home. Free to be who I wanted to be. And as I traveled across that strange astral plane, where time seemed to have stood still, I finally knew that there was nothing to fear, nothing to doubt. In travel, I had found my way of escape. I had my first real glimpse of death the year after graduating high school. I was living in Santa Cruz at the time, and on one really rainy afternoon, I decided to drive home to San Jose. So I got into my car and by myself, and I started driving on Highway 17 through the Santa Cruz Mountains, a really treacherous road that I had driven so many times in my adolescence, just trying to escape. So at this point, Radiohead had become a full-blown obsession, and so I'm listening to Tom York's very tortured voice as I'm maneuvering the slick twists and turns of the highway. But as I enter one particularly long, tight turn, I all of a sudden felt my tires start floating on a slippery part of the road. Before I knew it, I was gliding into the right lane. I felt my stomach lurch, and I started panicking. And letting everything that I had ever learned about hydroplaning out the window, I took my steering wheel and I just started turning it to the left. And then time slowed to a crawl. I was falling, but I couldn't tell which way was up or down, and as bits of my belongings flew past my face and the white light on the outside started to brighten, I realized that I couldn't hear anything except the first bars of the Radiohead song that had been playing. And all I could think was, not my car. Anything but my car. I still have so many places to go. My beloved secondhand convertible Volkswagen didn't survive the 360-degree roll on Highway 17. But I did, somehow. So I spent the next 12 years on the move, chasing after that high I felt every time I traveled or discovered someplace new, intoxicated by the possibility of finding a place to belong. I built my career out of it, carved my identity into the pages of my passport and mileage of my car. But As usual, the boundaries of my world would eventually close in on me when routine and mundanity set in. Now, I still haven't found that final destination I've been searching for. And yet, looking back, in the context of everything that's happened in my life, things are finally starting to make sense. My car, bikes, buses, planes, and trains, all the travel, it was never a means to flee to somewhere else. Rather, it was a way to exist within that place of ambiguity I've inhabited since birth. From epilepsy to remission, straddling different universes with a foot in every galaxy. You see, it's ultimately within those spaces between life and death, beyond borders and between worlds, that I've always felt the most alive and the most myself. Thank you.